have here. So if you were with us last week, we are just at the end of Matthew chapter 5, and I want to encourage you to pull those verses up on your phone or tablet or computer, or maybe you have your Bible in front of you. Matthew chapter 5, and last week we talked about this interesting passage where Jesus had said, an eye for an eye, but really I say to you, turn the other cheek. And this is a kind of a part one to what we're going to talk about at the end of chapter 5 this morning, because both concepts build on each other. And so here in verse 43 is where we'll pick up our message for this morning, Matthew 5:43. And Jesus, as he is coming in his inaugural sermon, he's coming as a rabbi, and he's teaching with the common rabbinical phrase, you have heard it says, but I tell you. So we have another one of those phrases that kind of introduces each new topic. So listen to what he says this week in verse 43 of Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, verse 44, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Ouch. Immediately, I'm not even going to keep reading for a second, because immediately Jesus has grasped the attention of his audience. What did he just say? He said, no, you don't just love your friends, but you should love your enemies and then pray for those who persecute you. Don't we pray for our friends? Isn't that a sign of love if one of our friends is suffering? And right now, of course, with the pandemic, we know that if we have friends who are battling COVID or facing some sort of physical challenge, or maybe they've been laid off, we quickly rally around our friends and we say, I'm going to pray for you. Let me pray for you. I'm so sorry to hear about these challenges, these struggles. But Jesus says, but also pray for those who persecute you, who are hostile to you. So immediately Jesus has our attention. And let's just read the whole passage, and then we'll kind of break it down and see what Jesus is getting at here. So he goes on in verse 45. He says, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get for that? And are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do this? Therefore, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Wow. Jesus does not mince words in this passage. And his teaching goes right to the core of our hearts. And I would just be honest, and I don't know if you feel it, it kind of goes completely against the grain of everything we naturally want to do, and how we naturally think, and how we naturally feel. And he says, you've heard it say, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Now it's interesting, I was looking these words up in the original language, and there's just so much extra information when you see it in the original. And it says that this word hate, it's a little bit of a strong word in English. I don't know if I would use exactly the word hate, because in the original language, Jesus is using a word of comparison. And you notice he says, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. And this word for hate is always used in comparison. So you like something and you dislike something else. So he says your neighbor, that would be someone you like. That's someone you're friends with. That's someone that's close to being family. And he says, by contrast, our enemies are the opposite. We keep them at a distance. We don't want anything to do with them. We don't welcome them into our houses. They are not in close proximity to us. And so maybe the better word there is love your neighbor, but dislike your enemy. In other words, it's something much lesser than. You love your neighbors, but man, your enemies, no, they don't even compare. And he says, but I tell you, love your enemies. And I looked up this word enemies. I said, okay, who is he talking about here? And I would like to suggest that maybe he's just saying, well, love those that are not so nice to you, but are very good people. But actually in the Greek, he chose the word for enemy. He chose the word for someone who is hostile and set against you and wants to go to war with you. This is a strong word. Jesus is not getting us off the hook here by saying, well, you can love those who are a little less lovable, but those real enemies, no, those people, you should hate them. Not at all. Jesus is talking about those real enemies. He's talking about those people that are intentionally setting their will against you, that are hostile to you. And so he doesn't let us off the hook in the original language here. And he says to pray for those who persecute you. Now, I remember when I was in 7th grade, I had something that the kids today would call a frenemy. Have you heard of a frenemy? A frenemy is that person that probably in the school setting, most likely, you're kind of friends with, but you're also in competition with. They're kind of the other cool person, the one you really want to beat, the one you want to be a little more popular than. And I had a frenemy, and he's still a good frenemy of mine today. And his name was Andy. And Andy and I, we would goof off together. We had a lot of fun together, but we would also be in competition together. Andy was good at sports, and I also was good at sports. And so we would often end up opposing each other on different teams, no matter what we were playing at recess. It seemed like Andy and I were always going against each other. And then, of course, 7th grade was that time, at least in my life, where we started to actually care what girls thought. And Andy was a good-looking guy, good at sports, and he was witty and funny, and the girls really liked Andy. And so I felt I had to be funnier and smarter. I needed to dress better because I wanted the girls to like me, and I wanted to be more popular. And so Andy and I had a little bit of this love-hate relationship, and I remember it came to a head when at PE we started playing flag ball. And our PE coach said, Andy, I want you to pick a team. Rick, I want you to pick a team. And I think we had 2 other people that picked teams. We had 4 teams in our small school. And every PE, there was a little schedule, and we'd play against each other. And I love football, and I love flag ball, and we had so much fun. And my team that I picked was doing really well. And even though this wasn't like professional sports, it was my world that year. And I still to this day remember that I would go home after each game and I'd write down the stats and I'd write down the scores of each game. And it came to the point where I was unbeaten, my team was unbeaten, and his team was unbeaten, and we were playing together for the first time. And so as we had met for this first match, I realized, well, this is kind of like the Super Bowl because whoever wins has the better record. And for me, it was the Super Bowl of 7th grade. And I remember the game began, and I had the ball, and we went and we tried to score, and we couldn't score. And then Andy's team had the ball, and they tried to score, and they couldn't score. And it went back and forth, and the game was scoreless. And I was looking at my little digital watch, which is a thing that most kids don't know anything about today, but I thought I was really cool because I had a digital watch. In fact, if I remember right, it was the one with the calculator. Now, that was super cool back then. A watch that could be a calculator? Unbelievable. Could it take pictures? No. No one ever thought of anything taking pictures back then. It was just a calculator, and it told me the time. And so I remember looking at my digital watch and realizing that PE class was about to come to an end. And it was the last drive of the game, and Andy's team had the ball. And I said to myself, okay, if we can just stop them on this drive, PE's almost about up, it'll be a tie, and I'm okay with that. We're both the best teams, and I will be okay with that. And so I was standing there, and Andy was a receiver, and I was taking him, and he had his quarterback, and they hike the ball, and Andy takes off as fast as he can go. Well, I recognize what's happening here. He's going to go for the touchdown, the long bomb. It's the last play of the game. I know exactly what's coming, and I know I'm fast, and I know Andy's fast. And I'm like, it's a race to the end zone. And so we take off running. And I think, you know what? I'm actually a little faster than Andy. And you know what? I think if I just lag a little behind Andy, The quarterback's going to think he's open and throw the ball, and I'm going to speed up, and it'll be a long bomb throw, so I'll have time to run under and catch it, and maybe I can run it back for a touchdown and pull off the upset victory and win the Super Bowl. That was my thought. It's kind of sad I still remember all of this today. I remember it like yesterday. And sure enough, my plan worked. As I let Andy have a step or two on me, I saw the young man at quarterback lean way back and just throw the ball as far as he could throw it. And now I saw the ball way up in the air, and I thought, this is perfect. All I have to do is run under it, get that interception, and I can win the game. So I turn up the speed, and I see the ball. But as I'm running, I realize something tragic is about to happen. That ball is going further than I'm probably going to be able to catch. And what I also see is that Andy has turned up the speed. And now, as the ball is getting closer, I'm starting to panic because I'm going as fast as my legs can go, and yet Andy is still a step or two ahead of me, and he's right where the ball is going. And I remember running with all my might and sprinting at the very last, and I jumped up and I stretched my arm as far as it would go. And in that jump, I thought, all right, I'm going to at least knock the ball down. And I swung at the ball to knock it down and save the game, and I missed. And I hit the ground, and I hear shouts of jubilation. And I stand up, and there's Andy on the ground with the ball in his arms in the end zone. Touchdown, and the PE teacher blows the whistle. The game is over, and it's done. Oh, I could not believe it. I was so close. I'm sure I just missed in my swat. My hand was there. I could feel it. I was going to knock that ball down. I don't know how I missed. I don't know how he caught it. Everything went wrong that day, and I remember walking back to our school from the playground and going, shaking my head, saying, how could this happen? How in the world could we have lost? I was there. I knew the play. I was ready, and yet it happened. Well, it took me a little bit before I was quite as friendly to Andy, because I was mad. He had showed me up. He had proved to be a little faster and more athletic, and his team had won. And Jesus would tell me, Rick, don't be mad. You're supposed to love your enemy. It's okay. He won the game. That's all right. But I couldn't do it. It took me quite a while, and you can see I still remember this. Andy is still my competition in a part of my brain because he always found a way to beat me a little bit, to be one step ahead of me. And I just point that out because I think sometimes when we read this passage, we think to ourselves, I don't really have any enemies. You know, I'm not one to hold a grudge. And I meet people who, when they read Jesus' words, they say, yeah, I agree with that. That's nice. You know, I don't really want to go out and have any enemies. And I just live my life, and I'm kind of chill about it. And yeah, I know people sometimes do this or that, but I just make it work. And I want to suggest to you that all of us have some enemies. We may just not understand exactly who they are. Because for all of us, and in Jesus' picture here that he's painting, for all of us, it's that person that we see as our competition. And maybe that's a better way to define it. Because in that case, it can actually be someone we like. It could actually be someone in our family. In fact, it could be your spouse. It could be a child. It could be your parents. It could be an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or someone, a neighbor. It could be somebody that you pretend to like, but secretly you do kind of wish they would fall down a couple notches. And so I want to challenge you this morning. I want to ask you this question, and I need you to take some time to reflect on it. Who is your enemy? Who gets your goat? Who raises your blood pressure a couple notches? Who irritates you? Who gets under your skin? Who challenges you? When you think of who you love and who you like being around, who is the opposite of that person? Who is the person that you avoid? Who is the person that you try not to spend that much time with? Because you might not have a nemesis. You might not be like all of our superhero movies where the superhero has an arch nemesis that they're always fighting against and they know who they are and who's going to win, and it's light versus dark and white versus black and strong versus or good versus evil. You may not have that dichotomy, but you might have someone in your life that you don't truly love because of X, Y, and Z, and it might even be for good reasons. Because Jesus is challenging us here to love like his Father loves us. Well, what does that love look like? Well, Jesus tells us. He said, my Father sends rain, and it blesses the good and the bad. It blesses the righteous and the unrighteous. He lets the sun shine on both. He lets the rain fall for both. My Father does not pick favorites. He just loves unconditionally. And Jesus draws a contrast, and he would have really shocked the hearers of his day, because as he gets to the end of this saying, he says, if you only love those who love you, what kind of reward is that? That's easy to do. Of course you love the people that like you. We love the people that love us, right? Nobody gets upset with the people that are always praising them, who are always making them feel great, who walk into the room and say, oh, look who it is. I love you. You're so great. You're so awesome. You're so fun. You're so smart. We love those kind of people. Wherever they are, they become our friends. Even if we think they're kind of faking it, we still like to have them around. In fact, I think there's that secret part of all of us that wish we had a little bit of celebrity, right? Like celebrities get this special treatment. Celebrities get people just wanting to take pictures with them and, oh, you're so wonderful. I love you on the show. I love you on this. I've seen you in that. And we all love those people. That's easy to do. But Jesus challenges us and he says, even the tax collectors do that. Even the pagans do that. Even the Gentiles do that. Now, this was Jesus' way of using those that were most despised in his audience. And he says, if you think you are superior, if you think that your religion makes you better than the tax collectors, makes you better than the lowest of our society, think again, because you act just like them. And Jesus is challenging you and I, and he says, you can be better. If you're a son and daughter of my Father, then you will act differently. You will think differently, and you will be above this mentality of, I will like those that like me. I'll give gifts to those who give gifts to me. It's a version of reciprocity. It's a version of wanting to only give to those who give to us. And Jesus says that's easy. Anyone can do that. But what separates my Father, what separates my kingdom from the earthly kingdom, is there's a love that transcends even those boundaries of good and evil, even those boundaries of being treated well, of friendliness, of righteousness, of goodness. Because my Father loves even the wicked people, even the evil people, even those who are struggling, who are stumbling. And Jesus, of course, was criticized in his ministry because he was always ministering to those whom they felt were unworthy of his love, unworthy of his compassion, unworthy of his time and attention. And Jesus says, if you're one of my followers, you're going to be like that too. And so I challenge you to think about, how do you treat those who can do nothing for you? How do you treat those who can't give back? I remember a time early in our ministry where we were invited over to someone's house to go for Sabbath lunch after the church service. And my wife at the time, she said, I don't know if we should accept the invitation. And I said, why not? We don't have any plans. Let's just go. They want to have us over. And she says, and I'll never forget this, but then we're going to have them over. And I said, what do you mean then we're going to have them? She said, well, you can't just, go over to someone's house and let them feed you and then not have them over. That's rude. I said, well, I don't think they're thinking that way. I think they just want to have us over, spend some time, eat some food together, and fellowship. I don't think they'll hold a grudge if we never have them to our house. Yeah, I think we just have to think about that. Would we have time to have them over? And this is how we think, right? In our current sinful earthly kingdom that we live. And sometimes I think we don't do things for people because we're worried then we're going to owe them. Or we don't accept things because we don't want to owe them, because we don't want to be caught in this kind of form of reciprocity, and that we don't want to be caught having to owe someone. And Jesus says, my Father doesn't think that way. He doesn't give because he thinks you're worthy. He gives because of who he is. And so when I look at this passage, he says in verse 46, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get for that? That's just normal. And by the way, the reward is you just each love each other, okay? That's the reward for that. And if you greet only your own people, then what are you doing more than anyone else? Instead, and here's the clincher, verse 48, therefore, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, this is interesting because I have heard this text, we all are familiar with this passage. I have heard this text preached in harmony with calling us to be perfectionists. I have heard this text preached as calling us to be pure as Christians, calling us to avoid certain sinful practices, calling us to be pure in what we take into our body. And I've heard this text used for a number of things we should be doing as a Christian because our Father in heaven is perfect and we're called to be perfect. But did you catch the context in which Jesus said this? It's important. I'll never forget, and I think I told this story once before, but it's worth telling again. I was sitting in class doing my theology degree at Southern Adventist University, and I believe it was Greek class, and our Greek professor, who was kind of an unusual and unique person, but very good at Greek, he had an interesting sense of humor, and he would tell us different jokes and stories, and he loved to tell us, he was an older gentleman, he loved to tell us stories of his childhood, and he wasn't a Christian growing up, and he had some crazy stories, and he just was a guy who loved life. And he was telling us one story of something that had happened more recently. And he said, he says, I'm good friends with so-and-so. He was one of the English professors at the college. And he said, we got this idea. There's this little paper that is circulated in the little town there where the university is. And this paper would just be thrown on your driveway, and it came out, I think, every 2 weeks or whatever. And it just gave you kind of the news for the little town there. And it had a classified section in the back. Again, for those of you that are younger, classifieds is when you had to put ads in a paper, not on Craigslist or Facebook. You had these newspaper things that were delivered, and that's how you found out what people were selling. And so he and his English professor friend, who had a good sense of humor, decided that they would submit ads that they thought were humorous. So one of the ads that they submitted said this: used parachute for sale, used only once, never opened. You can see right away it's a joke. But he said, and he was telling us this story, he still got a call from a farmer who said, hey, do you have that parachute? Do you think it would work to cover my chicken house? I need to keep these chickens in the shade. And of course they explained to him, used once, never opened. It's just a joke. They were just having some fun. And then another time, they put a used coffin for sale in this little paper. And he did report to us, nobody did call him about that purchase, which is good to know that nobody was shopping for a used coffin. Well, we were in this Greek class. I remember the class was 8 in the morning, so it was always a rough class. So these little stories brightened our day, and we were laughing as a class, except when all of a sudden the mood of the class changed when one of the students in the class said, "So, it's all right to lie then." Dead silence. We looked around like, who had the guts to say that? And there was a student in the middle of the classroom, and we could see he looked really angry. And I thought to myself, oh boy, this will be good. This will be good, because I know the professor, and I know he's not going to handle this really great either. And the professor looks at the student. He's shocked too. And he said, "Excuse me?" And the student said, "So you think it's all right to lie?" And he says, "It was a joke." And he says, "But it was a lie." And the professor says, "It was a joke." And then the student says, then the professor says, "Show me in the Bible where I have done something wrong." Now, you don't want to bait this guy. He knew the whole Bible in Greek. But this student was very convicted, and he said, "Be ye perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect." And we all looked, and then we looked back at the professor. We're waiting for this one, like, where is this going to go? Oh, boy. And it was a tense atmosphere. And the professor pauses, and he says, "Okay, I'm glad you had a scripture for what you're saying." But he says, "Do you know what that says?" Because that same verse is found in another gospel, and it's worded a little differently. And the student says, I don't think so." And he says, "No, come on, you brought this up. You're telling me I'm not being perfect. I need to be perfect like my Father in heaven. Now you share with me, what does that really mean? You must know, if you're quoting this verse, you must know what it really means. So tell me what it really means and show me how I've sinned." And the student kind of, "Well, it says be perfect, and God would never lie, so you shouldn't lie." And he says, "Hold on." He says, "Tell me what it means from the scripture, because don't just tell me what you think it means. Show me." He says, it's used in another place." And he's like, he says, "Okay, come on, tell me where it's used in another place." Now it's getting heated. And the professor's leaning forward, and he's going in for the kill. And the student just starts backpedaling and stumbling and stammering. And I'll never forget, I literally remember the verse from that day forward. He says, "Well, it's also found in Luke 6:36. And that was news to me. I'm like, "It is?" So, of course, a lot of us are there turning in our Bibles, Luke 6:36. And when you go to Luke 6:36, it says this. It's Jesus quoting the same thing. It's the same words that we just read, except that in Luke, it has him saying, "Be ye merciful, as your Father in heaven is merciful." And so now you can say, well, which one is it? Is it perfect? Is it merciful? Which author got it right? Did Jesus say it twice? How do we reconcile this? Which is the correct interpretation? I don't know if Jesus said it twice. I think it's very possible. But whatever it was, when you see the context, you realize that both are correct. Because the perfection that Jesus is talking about is the incredible mercy of God. The perfection he's talking about is not about whether you told a lie. It's not about how perfect you live your life. It's not about what you put into your mouth. The perfection he's talking about is the ability of God to love even his enemies. And if you don't believe me, look at Christ's life. One of the things I love about the teaching of Jesus in this first sermon is that when you continue to read the gospel, you see that Jesus lived everything he taught. And when you get to the end of Matthew, and they arrest Jesus, and they come with torches in the middle of the night with clubs and weapons, and they mock Jesus. They take him before Herod, they take him before Caiaphas, they take him before Pilate, they beat him, they scourge him. Jesus only treats his persecutors and his enemies with love and compassion. In fact, it's no wonder that Ellen White says we should spend a thoughtful hour every day contemplating the final scenes of Jesus' life. Why? Because when you see how he handled the abuse, the persecution, the enemies, the hostility, all of it, you see an incredible love that can only be divine. If you want to say what sets apart God from humanity, it is this ability to love in the face of anger, abuse, persecution. Do you remember what Jesus said? He didn't say much those final 24 hours before his crucifixion. When he was beaten, when he was mocked, when he was scourged, when they put a crown of thorns on his head, when they called out to him, "Come on, you're the king, save yourself." Jesus did not taunt them back. Jesus did not get angry with them back. Jesus did not fight with them. Jesus did not defend himself. Jesus did not strike someone back when they struck him. You remember what Jesus said? He looked out at the crowd screaming for his crucifixion. And he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And in that prayer, you and I are part of that mob. Because we too have sinned. We too have rebelled against him. And he looks at us with love and compassion and grace. And he cries out, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." He sees beyond the current action. He sees beyond our current mistakes, our current sinfulness, our current behavior, and he just wants to reconcile with us. Now that's a love I can't comprehend. I get pretty mad if someone just cuts me off on the beltway. I get angry when someone interrupts my time and I'm busy and I have to. You ever get, all right, let's be real here. You ever have your phone ring right in the middle of something and you look at it and it doesn't matter who it is, you're mad at them for calling? It's like, oh, it's them. And they didn't deserve it. They had no idea you were in the middle of something. They're just trying, and maybe they're calling just to tell you they love you or check on you, but you're like, oh, why are they interrupting me? I can't take this right now. And we just kind of get annoyed and we get angry. Like it doesn't take much for us, does it? But God has this amazing love that just no matter how poorly or whatever we do to him, he just keeps loving us. I think the closest we can come to this is being parents. Because when you have that child, there's just something that happens and you just know that no matter what this kid does, you're going to still love them. And we see it all the time. We see children who take advantage of their parents and we think, boy, they need to really crack down on that. But we also, as parents, know it's hard when it's your own child. Because you want to take care of them. You want to save them. You want to help them. You want to kind of get them through whatever they're going through. And when they're in pain, you're in pain. And God looks down on this world and he sees his children. And he loves them. And he sees beyond our foolishness. He sees beyond our sinfulness. And his grace meets us at the point of our need. And if you've been touched by that grace, and this is what Jesus is saying, if you know your Father, then that should make you different in how you treat others. You should be different than the tax collector. You should be different than the pagan who doesn't know God. If your Father has shown that love and mercy and grace to you, if you, like the prodigal son, have come home and been welcomed with a big embrace, have a party thrown for you, even though you were the one that was a sinner, you were the one who didn't deserve it, if you've received that lavish grace, then won't you have it for others? And so he challenges us. And he gives us some practical advice. He says, when you have an enemy, you need to stop thinking them of an enemy and start seeking to love them. When someone is persecuting you, Instead of responding in kind, instead of going to war with them, he says, get down on your knees and pray for them. And why do you pray for them? Pray that God will change them? Well, you can pray that, and maybe God will. But anyone who spent time in prayer knows that what usually happens in prayer is God starts to change us. He starts to change our attitude. And this is one of the things that we have to always understand about these teachings of Jesus. If we go legalism with these teachings, we are missing the point. Jesus is not saying just treat them well and then you'll get into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is not saying bite your tongue and don't respond in kind, although those are all good things. If you listen to Jesus, what he's saying is, I want to change your attitude towards them. Because if you love your enemy, then they're not your enemy anymore. And if you start praying for those who persecute you, they're no longer the persecutor. They're someone who needs the love and grace of God. This is why Paul can say later, our battle is not against flesh and blood. We're all fellow sinners. Of course, we take turns hurting and wounding each other, and we even in the church sometimes get at odds with each other and go to war with each other or try to take someone down, and even in church it can happen. But Paul reminds us, listen, the teaching of Jesus says, love your enemies. These people around you, they're not your enemy. We're all in the same boat. We all are sinners in need of the grace and lavish love of our God. And so let's join him in loving others, in looking past all those offensive things and even their bad behaviors. Now, don't get me wrong, Jesus, as we talked about last week, he's not saying there's never a time for boundaries. What he's talking about is your heart. Your heart. You can still have boundaries, but you can set boundaries in love. And that's what he wants. He wants love to be the motive. He wants love to be the motive for every decision in how you treat others. And he wants you to transform your heart by not letting their anger, their bitterness, their negativity creep in and become part of your life. And the beautiful thing about God is he's not just trying to challenge us. He's not just trying to find a way so that we can't measure up. He's not just trying to show us how terrible it is. I'm so loving and you guys are terrible at it. What he's saying is, this is the ideal. And it's going to be hard. It doesn't come naturally for us. But this is the ideal, and the more you strive for that ideal, the more free you will be. There's nothing more powerful in this universe than love. And that's why John, who spent so many years with Jesus, will say in his letter, God is love. God is love. This is his perfection. This is who he is. This great, unconditional, unmerited love that is lavish because of who he is, a loving being. And he wants to make us into his image. So I want to challenge you. I challenged you at the beginning of this sermon. Who is your enemy? Who is difficult for you to love? Who gets under your skin? You know, we've been in this pandemic for almost a year now. Can you believe this? Almost a year. And they tell us that divorce rates are up. Domestic violence is up. It's been a huge adjustment for all of us. And I may be talking to someone today who, when I really ask this question, they're thinking about someone in their own home. Because things have been stressful. We're always around. We're getting in each other's way. We're stumbling over each other at home, working at home, school at home, and all these things. Maybe today's sermon is your call to come back to that attitude of love towards your children, towards your spouse, towards the people in your home. You know, God is gracious to you, and one day he's going to invite you into his home, and he's going to let you live there forever. So maybe now it's time to start welcoming those that are in your own home. Instead of seeing them as an enemy, instead of seeing them as people that are ruining your efficiency and your time and not giving you your quiet space. Maybe this is your call to love them in a new way. 2021 can be a new year. Maybe 2020 was really difficult. Maybe you lost your job, and maybe you lost it because someone had it in for you and they kind of maligned you, and you were let go and they were kept on. Now is your time to pray for them, to give them into God's hands and to say, they're not my enemy. I don't walk this earth to have enemies. I walk this earth as a child of the King, loved with outrageous love, forgiven for my sins and willing to forgive others for theirs. It's a radical way to live. It doesn't come naturally. It's something you're going to have to pray for. It's something that's going to call you to your knees. And maybe it's going to call you to your knees 3 or 4 times a day because you have somebody in your life that's just that stressful. But if it calls you to your knees, you're winning the battle. And you're doing what Jesus has called you to do and what will lead to your own freedom and a heart that is vibrating with the love of the kingdom of God. Jesus cares about you. He cares about your heart. He cares about your thoughts. He wants you to be at peace. He wants you to have that love. He wants you to have that joy. And so what he's teaching you this morning can radically change who you are, what you feel, how you think. And it's a transformation that I think once it starts to take hold, you'll never want to go back. So he's calling you to something new this year. He's calling you to be like him. It's the highest ideal. And yeah, you're going to stumble and fall. Yeah, you're going to have some bad days where you don't just quite make it, but that's okay because his love is always there to pick you up. He will forgive you. He will set you back on your feet, dust you off, and you can try again. Because that's how strong his love is for you. And now his challenge is to extend that same love to others. I want that to be part of my journey this year, don't you? That is my goal for 2021. When people start to irritate me, get under my skin, I want to recall the teaching of Jesus. I want to take it as a call to prayer so that God can work in my heart, so that I will not let the devil get root and plant seeds of anger or hatred or vengeance or revenge, but that all that beats in my heart is the heart of God's love, that my heart beats in sync with him. This is what it means to live in his kingdom, and this is my prayer for you this year.